This is Dale Nesbary, president of Muskegon Community College. It is my honor to welcome you to MCC's celebration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. While our MLK breakfast event featuring political strategist Donna Brazil has been postponed until June 10th due to COVID safety protocols, I welcome you to join a distinguished panel of community leaders today, led by MCC's Chief Diversity Officer Kenneth James, as they discuss the meaning of Dr. King's impact on our community and society.
Hello, my name is Ken James, and I proudly serve as Chief Diversity Officer for Muskegon Community College. I would like to welcome you to our panel discussion titled, The Timeless Impact of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Local Reflections. In just a few moments, you will hear from our esteemed panelists. Muskegon Community College had to postpone our 25th annual Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Unity Day breakfast, which was originally scheduled for Friday, January 14th, 2022. The new date is June 10th, 2022. Donna Brazil, who is a Washington, D.C. political strategist and regular national news contributor, will remain as the keynote speaker. Any ticket purchased for the January 14th breakfast will be honored at the rescheduled event. Now to our panel. I would like to share with you that Muskegon Community College has a diversity, equity, and inclusion strategy that revolves around 4 cornerstones. Those cornerstones are cultural awareness, workforce organization strategy, cultural competency, and community outreach. Today, we will focus on the cornerstone of community outreach. Muskegon Community College is sincere in its tradition of honoring the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Although circumstances have required us to postpone the Unity Day breakfast, we are delighted to present this panel discussion. Without further ado, I am pleased to turn to our panelists, and we have with us today Kimberly Sims, former mayor and community advocate, Nicholas Budimir, full-time instructor, Sociology, Muskegon Community College, Darius Mitchell, Director of Housing and Economic Security for the Urban League of West Michigan. What I'd like to do is have each panelist share with you who they are and what they do, and I will go in the order that they are to my left, and Kim, if you would go first.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and to the committee for organizing the event. I'm most appreciative. Again, my name is Kimberly Sims. I'm the community advocate, also a doula. And I like to say I'm kind of whatever the community needs, I try to fill in that gap. Former mayor of this great city of Muskegon Heights, which I'm very proud of, and just advocate for anything that needs to be done to make our community a better place to live, work, and play.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Nicholas?
Oh, hi, Ken.
Hello.
Thanks for having me. Nicholas Budimir. I'm a full-time sociology instructor here at the community college. I've been here 11 years. Teach sociology, and I have specific interests in class, the labor movement, race and ethnic inequality, and I teach classes in those areas, including like social problems and labor studies, which kind of focuses on American labor movement. So I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. Darius?
Again, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having us, Ken. Darius Mitchell, Director of Housing and Economic Security for the Urban League of West Michigan. The Urban League was founded over 100 years ago with 2 tenets in mind: economic self-reliance for African Americans and social justice. Me specifically, 2 things that I champion daily are workforce development or employment and housing. As we talk a little further about racial disparities and things of that nature, I'll expand a little more. But advocacy, teaching, any information that I can get out to the underserved communities, unapologetically African American communities, but other underserved communities as well, just around those things. The goal is to help close those racial divides so that the individuals can be empowered, because we understand that in order to close these disparities, a major part of that is self-reliance. So.
All right. Well, again, thanks to each of you for being here. So Nicholas, we'll start with you with our first question. And when you think about the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, what does that mean to you, and how does that impact the work that you do today?
Oh, sure, Ken. I'd love to say Dr. King's legacy has always mattered, but the thing is, I grew up in an immigrant ethnic family on the east side of the state. My father was born overseas, and while my mother was relatively progressive, a lot of white folks in America don't sort of deeply internalize what the civil rights struggle, what the Black freedom movement has meant for everybody in America. So a little bit later in life, early 20s, I had to kind of force myself to learn and to internalize and then to appreciate the complexity of not only this man, but the movement he mobilized. I like all the M's too. I think sometimes we iconize Dr. King or sometimes Malcolm X, and we iconize them and we put them on a pedestal and we quote the I have a dream speech or something like that. And everyone knows he had a dream, but we don't know what the dream was. So I try to appreciate the complexity, right? His stances against the Vietnam War. He died promoting the Poor People's Campaign, right? So I think ignorantly or naively, people think, oh, Dr. King was just for black people. Dr. King improved the country as well as the entire movement that he was part of for everybody, right? So every American benefited from this movement. In fact, the world benefited from this movement. South Africa benefited from this movement. So I try to sort of internalize and, at least in a sort of meek, humble way, talk to students about this. And this wasn't a movement that ended in April 4th, 1968. It's part of a much larger sort of progressive movement on the half of working people everywhere.
All right. Nicholas, thank you very much. Darius, I'll come to you with the same question. And when you think about the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, what does that mean to you, and how does it impact the work that you do today?
As I think about it, and Dr. King, I'll think about it. It was kind of twofold, but now as I expand a little bit, it's really threefold in my maturation as an individual. So there's Darius the adolescent, then there's Darius the employee, then there's Darius who is a leader, but also an employee. So I get to see it from a different side. So as Nicholas was saying, they were icons. We have jokingly laughed about our childhoods and the velvet paintings, and it's Black Jesus or Jesus and Martin Luther King or Malcolm X. They were there, and the wooden spoon. And so from that space, it was church programs. I can't count how many times that I've played Martin Luther King and I've had to recite that speech, or it's Black History Month, and that's the first thing that we're going to talk about is the I Have a Dream speech and his legacy. And it was naively marginalized to this, a lot of times back then in educational space, to the Montgomery Bus boycott and Rosa Parks, and that was pretty much it. And it got a little bigger, and kind of the climax was the I Have a Dream speech. But for me, the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 68, which 64 dealt with discrimination, voting rights, and segregation, and then 68, which is also termed or looked at as the Fair Housing Act. You look at these, and these are now things that mean something to me as an employee. I had no idea that these things even mattered. In a HR or workspace, we talk about protected classes or the 7 protected classes. When you start talking about familial status and origin and sex and race, I had no idea what any of that meant. Darius, don't do this. Nope, I'm not going to do any of that because that's not who I am. But I didn't realize where that came from. And Nicholas talked about the I Have a Dream speech. And even though 64, 68 are big for the civil rights movement, what people don't really understand, and this was something that I was stumbled across this morning, the I Have a Dream speech was a sales pitch, if you will. He was pitching that this is what individuals should have. So we understand that President Lyndon B. Johnson signed it, but he was talking to the country at that time, and if I'm not mistaken, President Kennedy was president. So again, these things were moving. We talked about the 50s. So you talk about Martin Luther King, but it was a furtherance of something that needs to happen. And the Urban League was there to help champion those causes for, again, African Americans unapologetically and other underserved communities, to help them in this space to be able to purchase a home or have access to a loan or not be a victim of redlining. And redlining is literally, back in those times, they would take a red marker and draw around where only African Americans could or couldn't stay. So when you think about being the director of housing and economic security, now as a leader who's also an employee, it has a different space for me, because now not only do those words resonate, I am a student of those. I study those things, because when I'm advocating and championing, I want to abreast myself to the technicalities of it. So as I'm giving this information and disseminating and sharing this information, I'm doing it properly, so that in my advocacy, my good is not evil spoken. So I couldn't have imagined at 12, I couldn't have imagined at 24, that at 42, I would be the director of housing and economic security. And one of the major reasons I exist are the civil rights acts that he helped to advocate for.
All right. Darius, thank you for that. And Kim, if I could come to you with the same question. So when you think about the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, what does that mean to you, and how does it impact the work you do today?
You know, it's funny. I was raised by my grandmother, right? And so in our home, the picture hung on the wall. We talked about it, right?
Yep.
The picture hung on the wall, but the fact that he was Reverend, right, a leader in the Black church, carried a lot of weight in our household. And so we talked about his work. He was part of family conversation. We followed, you know, well, at the time I was born, they taught me a lot about the movement and what was good about it, honestly, what was bad about it, why they felt like it didn't work and what they felt like happened. And we had those conversations around the table. So for me, the legacy is just a continuation of what my life is. I lived that, right? I live what they told me from Dr. King. I live now what I've learned through my reading. A lot of people loved I Have a Dream speech. I loved the letters from Birmingham. That is, right, to me, that's like, that's it, that's it. So for me, when I think about the legacy of Dr. King, it's a reminder of the work that is yet to be done. The Urban League still exists.
Correct.
The housing and the racial discrimination still exists. Those things are still there. We still have work to do. So for his legacy, it reminds me that there's still to do. I started a good work, right, because I had a dream. Now it's up to you guys to complete. And so for me, it's just a reminder of that there is more to be done.
All right, thank you, and thank to each of you for those responses. And let's continue on with our discussion. And so Dr. Martin Luther King played a pivotal role in the civil rights movement by advocating for peace and racial equality. But currently in this nation, we continue to see social injustices. In your own words, please share with us how we can create a vision of hope for all Americans and express how the struggle is a reality for so many people, but we can persevere despite the struggle. And Darius, I'd like to come to you first. Thinking of MLK and the work of the Urban League, please share with us, where do we go from here?
So as we've talked about in this furtherance, I think one of the major issues they found that contributed to the racial disparities, one of the key things was education. And I think that, as Nicholas said, in our attempt to make them icons because we wanted to give them their just due, I think, my own personal opinion, that we've kind of taken the movement and put it there as well. So we say, well, it's the civil rights movement of 1960, whatever have you, not realizing that, as Mayor Sims just said, this is the same stuff that we're talking about today. So mistakenly, we've done that. It wasn't intentional, but when you put the people there, what they're associated for, sometimes that happens. So I think education is important. And what I mean by that is, for instance, for me in the Urban League, we advocate for home ownership. So we have programs that we are putting together to give this education, again, understanding that in the Civil Rights Act, that was one of the main reasons for them. They didn't have the access to education. So along with myself, I have a whole department that are HUD counselor certified. So we know the ins and outs of how to get a loan, what works best for you, what's the difference between a bank and a credit union, or a conventional loan and an FHA loan. So when you have that, when you give information, as we've always said, information is power. And I think we need to educate ourselves. And once we do that, then I think that what we need to do is have some solidarity. I think that Mayor Sims talked about some of the conversations from the elders, and they talked about kind of some of the things that have gone wrong in the civil rights movement, given their opinions and why it didn't work. But in some of my own studies, what I've looked at in that is these movements were solely tied to individuals versus saying, well, this is the movement. I'm going to come, I'm going to give you the information because I'm in your town for the weekend. So I don't want it to be when I leave that the movement leaves with me, or the energy. So I need to empower you with that information so you can do what you need to do in your community. So I think we need that. I think we need solidarity in the sense that we all are do-gooders in that space, but we all do it kind of differently. So let's not silo ourselves. So if there is a Urban League and there's a NAACP, two main pillars, we don't always work together the best. Why is that? I don't have that answer, but let's have that conversation. And I think that's something that's very important to do. And then also too, to the individuals who have the information, don't be a gatekeeper. And when we talk about being a gatekeeper, we talk about power with information. So don't be someone who looks to take advantage of your own individuals because you have this power and they're ignorant to the fact of what you're doing. So if we have solidarity with our leadership, if we can come and we talked about voting. So if we come together and say, we have a block, we have a group of individuals and we're going to move in a certain direction, that gives us a little more teeth in what we're doing. What we find now is that we have so many different grassroots organizations that we've siloed ourselves some, and you divide and conquer. So solidarity, make sure you disseminate information, and again, educate yourself. The resources are there. Take advantage of those and understand that even though Dr. Martin Luther King and other individuals started it, the hunt is still on. So we still need to increasingly do better.
Okay. Darius, thank you for that. And, Kim, I'd like to come to you next and still thinking about this legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. Think of your experiences as an elected official and your role as a community advocate. Using your own words, if I were to give you the words of dream, believe, and do, what comes to mind?
Really? I just had something real good off what Darius just said. So I'm going to go to your question first, right? And then I'll go back to a comment that Darius made. So as an elected official in that role, I had a very, very, many times I reflected on Dr. King, I'll be candid, right? Because what he did was inspired hope at a time when it was lacking, right? There was an immense struggle in the country. Black people were being left behind. He saw that. But yet he could galvanize people and command people, and they left with a hope so strong that honestly, they stood barking dogs. I ain't sure I could have did that.
Sure.
The water cannons, I know I couldn't have did that one, right? But they stood and they faced those things based on the hope that Dr. King had led them to, right? And so in my work as an elected official, I saw that as part of my job, honestly, was to instill hope in the community to do what I knew could be done in the community. To be able to work, even though I see the dogs behind us, I know that the water cannons are out there and they're coming for us, right? But to be able to try to galvanize the people in a way to move progress forward. And I think that that's how I can tie into kind of what Darius just talked about. One of the things that we saw in the civil rights struggle that I can say today we don't see very much, right, is the organized.
Right.
The people, they were organized.
Yeah.
And so if you think and you look at the history of the NAACP and the Urban League, they worked at that time in tandem.
Correct.
They worked together.
Yeah.
Right? And so it was the Urban League that was going to bring up the issue to say, we have an issue here and we need you to address it in these areas.
Sure.
And it was the NAACP then that would come through the door and kick the doors down. They told you we got an issue, fix it.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
So they work together in tandem that way. We don't see that anymore. But in my household, going back to that, that was one of the things that was discussed as a problem within the movement, was they gave us enough to divide us. Right? And I speak to many elders about the issue, and it resonates with some of them. We struggled so hard, but yet to see this is where we are. Right? And so when I think about those questions, those words, as an elected official, it was my responsibility to encourage people to dream, to allow them to understand and believe that they could do what it was that needed to be done to move our community to the next level. So that's.
Wow.
Excuse me, Kim, before you pass it to Nicholas,
Go
I
ahead.
just think that's so profound, Kim, and you put it in that way that they worked in tandem. If you look at the disparities, if you look at social justice, if you look at the economics, if you look at the fair housing, all of those issues or disparities work in tandem as well. So this is what I mean by that. So as the Director of Housing and Economic Security, when I'm talking to individuals about home ownership, well, how can you have a home if you don't have a livable wage, or like what we like to say, a thriving wage? Not just to enough just to get by, but you want to be able to have a livable wage and then have some access for retirement and things of that nature. Conversely, if someone's talking to me and they're gainfully employed, and we understand now that, oh my God, I mean, rent is almost 2 to 3 times as much as a mortgage. So then I'm advocating and talking to those individuals about home ownership. So again, here is an issue that's its own issue, but it has 2 sides that need to work in tandem. Everything that we have to deal with, good or bad, it usually has 2 sides to it. And what we normally do, we focus so hard on one that we don't necessarily champion the other at that time. So it was, hey, they're not letting us into school, they're not letting us into the workplace, so let's make sure that we educate ourselves so that when we apply for these jobs, our record is so impeccable that it screams discrimination if they don't give us the job. However, in my opinion, what we didn't do a great job of collectively is say, some of us need to be entrepreneurs and have our own thing. We were so intent on making sure that we could use the same facilities or things of that nature, which were great. But at some point, it was going to be important to have our own. So now that's why for the Urban League of West Michigan, or the National Urban League, self-reliance is such a big thing, because, hey, we want you to be a part of the status quo in the mainstream, but you got to have some stuff for yourself. You can't be totally dependent on a system or a construct. You have to be able to go kind of get it yourself and be self-sustaining, because at the end of the day, if you are always at the end of someone's gift, then we also know what that means. So.
Well, thank you for that, bringing up some good points. And Nicholas, I'm going to be coming back to you. And one of the things that I heard, and I wrote down the word, we talked about a little bit of turfdom and different things we need to get beyond, because, division can keep, everyone down, but how can we unify and see what the power is there? But Nicholas, I'd like to come back to you and thinking of Martin Luther King and his legacy and your work as a full-time instructor here at Muskegon Community College in sociology, and sharing with this group that you grew up in an immigrant community and all the things that shape you. So if I was to give you the statement that the struggle is real, how would you respond to that?
Well, yeah, it's a good statement, Ken. So the struggle is real because it impacts real people, right? So as probably all of us were doing, we were perusing a little bit of reading before we came here, and I have the Radical King sitting over there, edited by Cornel West. We should all read that one. But I came across his speech, "The Other America," right? And in "The Other America," Dr. King talks about one America that is prosperous and affluent, and then he talks about the other America where, if I'm probably screwing up the quote, where the, I think he uses the phrase, the buoyancy of progress is drowned in the anguish of defeat. I probably screwed up, that's probably a paraphrase there. But he talked about two Americas, right? An extremely affluent society that had, and his quote, had 40 million people in poverty. Well, you fast forward from 1967, 1968, when he gave that speech, to the 2000s to 2021, we still have literally anywhere at any one time between 38 million and 46 million, given the fluctuation, people in poverty. And we still haven't, this very, very affluent society still hasn't tackled that. And we also know that 12 years after Dr. King's death, so about 1980 or so, lo and behold, homelessness becomes a problem when it almost wasn't. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So, part of that was some much needed reform in the psychological reformatory community. But a big part of that was these seismic shifts in jobs and the seismic shifts in industry. And these have absolutely, we know that every shift in jobs, shift in industry, it disproportionately, not only disproportionately hits African Americans and Latinos, but it always hits working people. It always hits poor people. Poor people are always getting the short end of the stick in any kind of restructuring of the system. So it's so real. We could just as much in 2008 or 2018 have had a Poor People's Campaign. Sure. Remember, he's on the Poor People's Campaign on the way to this large march, another march in Washington. Sure. I believe it was scheduled for May of '68, and he diverts himself to Memphis. And they say, no, Dr. King, don't go to Memphis. And why does he divert himself to Memphis? It's to help these it's to help these sanitation workers who they didn't want they needed more wages. Of course, they were working for starvation wages in an affluent society, but it was dignity and respect, right? Because two of their fellow workers were crushed to death in a garbage truck because the city didn't see to it to give them enough dignity to create a shelter from the rain. Yeah. Well, how many workers at, fast forward 60 years, how many workers in the fast food industry or the poultry industry or the meat processing industry have their hands cut every day? How many, during COVID, what we're dealing with right now, how many workers were forced to contract COVID because the working conditions were too cramped and unsafe? That's why it's real, because it impacts real people.
The struggle is real. Thank you for that. So each of you have given some really broad but very strong things when I think about the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King. You brought up socioeconomics. We talked about the historical concept you shared that you were raised by your grandmother, and a couple of things. So just as we continue, and this is for anyone, just as you think about a few things as I captured our conversation here, and I want to share with you a historical aspect and something from my own research. So a few years ago, I did a presentation on Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, and I went to the mountaintop speech. Okay. With that, which if you read that in its depth, it's almost like he was foretelling that something was about to happen. He might not get there with us. But when we think about socioeconomics, we think about the historical aspect, we think about his legacy. I just want to ask each of you to respond in your own words. Just, are there any quotes that resonate with you from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King? Are there any maybe memories you have from people that might have been around during the time? So I'm probably the oldest person on this panel, and I was born after the death of Martin Luther King. But my father, who was one of my idols, he actually was serving in the United States Navy during the Civil Rights Movement. So I have those oral histories that he shared with me about going through the Civil Rights Movement and being in the armed forces. So maybe just so the question is broad, and any of you can respond. Are there any quotes that you would like to share or that have moved you? Or are there any historical oral histories that have been shared with you around Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King?
Well, Ken, I do have one, if you don't mind. Right at the tip of my tongue, I was looking at it, and there's a couple of different speeches where he iterates sort of the same concepts. And basically on the topic of socioeconomics or class, and he was talking about when you put profits over people, and it's a famous quote, the evil triplets of racism, militarism, and extreme materialism dominate, right? So, and unfortunately, it's not just 1967, 68 during the Vietnam War, but we haven't mentioned it, we're extremely divided country right now. And, are we facing sort of a division over racism, over militarism? I'm reading a book right now about white evangelical masculinity. It's called Jesus and John Wayne. I highly recommend it.
I will read
I've got it right over there. But it talks about how a sort of militarized imperialism almost has taken over sort of a branch of American Christianity. And what does that lead to? Extreme materialism in the sense of overconsumption. How many cars can we have? How many cell phones do we have? Can we consistently consume and consume and consume when nearly half the continent of Asia and nearly the entire continent of Africa, 3% of the population is vaccinated. In this very abundant world, so the triplets.
And that's a lot to think about. And again, just the thing, and so far, even for our viewing audience, as we think about Reverend Martin Luther King and what you decide to do on the national holiday, we always encourage people to reflect, to do research, to attend events, to get more information, but you bring in some good points. So, but back maybe Darius or Kim, just in your own words, when you think about your favorite Martin Luther King quote or any oral histories that were shared with you, is there anything you'd like to share with our viewing audience?
I think for me, it was kind of two-part. One was more of a historical standpoint, as I began to do some research myself, and I'll kind of tie that to Dr. King. But then the other part of it was from my mother, who was born in Mississippi. She was born in 1958. So, when you started thinking about, civil rights struggle and just racism and discrimination, I won't call it the epicenter at that time, but Mississippi comes to mind very quickly. You think about the young men who lost their lives in the voter registration, cinematically, the movie Mississippi Burning. I still watch that to this day. But just listening to my mother and her, sharing with me as a young man, my family's very, as Mayor Sims said, very deeply rooted in the history of black individuals, not just the Martin Luther Kings or the Rosa Parks. And she told me about Emmett Till as a young man, and at around the same age when Emmett Till was, brutally murdered. And in that, for her telling me that, Darius, how you are as a young man, you could liken yourself to him. So just imagine not being able to say to Nicholas, how is your day? or that I couldn't, this is a crime. I can't look him in his eyes. I'm sitting next to him. This is cause or would warrant my death. So for her to, share with me on that side of it, just kind of give me a perspective. And I'm like, I couldn't imagine, as Mary Sims talked about, the water cannons and the dogs, like how she couldn't do that. I don't think, Ken, that I would have been able to not do that because I'm just a personable person. I'm sure I would have done my best, but my mother probably wouldn't have let me out the house because I'm just a cordial young man. So from that standpoint, then on the other standpoint of just when you think about geographically these pockets of America that were looked at as African American cities, right? So coming out of the 50s, they migrated here because in Muskegon County, we had those factories and those industries that paid, again, not a livable wage, at that time a thriving wage, where we started to see African Americans come into what would be termed as a kind of a middle class, or start of that of home ownership and real employment and with seniority and benefits and things of this nature. And she said,
unions.
In unions. And she said, Darius, Los Angeles was not a hotbed, or Detroit wasn't a hotbed for African Americans just because someone spun the globe playfully and said, we're going to go there. They were escaping domestic terrorism. So in this space, we don't know where we're going to go, but again, then they were so collective. Okay, well, this whole block is going because we do everything together. We're going to move together. That way we can babysit each other's children. The men went to work. The women had, the social clubs. They made the clothes because we don't know what's over there. But we're going to go to bed. We're going to go together, because it's better than here. And that's something that when I grew up and I started to look at that, it gave me a different frame of reference when you talk about a Philadelphia or Detroit or Chicago in these pockets. It wasn't because someone said desirably that I'm just going to go to Chicago because I heard that it's Disneyland for adults. They were trying to escape something. They didn't have any idea, but they had each other. And on the side of Martin Luther King, what I thought about is, and I don't know the speech he was talking about, but he was talking about at this time farming, and he was speaking about how the term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And he was making the comparison that you have these poor black farmers that don't have the equipment to be progressive or to compete in these markets, and why the government was deliberately giving subsidiaries, and subsidies to other non-minorities so they could mechanize and get their things to the marketplace. And he said, how can you tell me that I need to pull myself up and just work harder, but you're intentionally not giving me this and you're giving it to somebody else? So naturally they would kind of start leading me in the race. They have better equipment or better resources. So as I move forward, and anytime I'm dealing with workforce development or housing, that's how I approach it first. How did we get here? What was the origins of this issue from the first place? Because then if I can understand kind of holistically both sides of it, then I can start to understand that, well, if I address this side of it, sooner or later, I'm going to have to address something else. So let me do some homework before I just start making plans to change things, because I need to think about things more holistically in my approach. So that was something, I don't have a quote, but when I would read that, that's what I got. Like, it's not just that somebody didn't have, why didn't they have? And then not only why didn't they have, what did that cause on the other end of it that helped start these disparities? And now that we look at that in 2022, but it wasn't a 2022 thing, it's happened many moons ago.
Thank you.
That's a good point. And so this is what's funny, and I'm I'm proud for that my son is not watching because I'm not going to remember this quote. But in the quote, he talked about the oppressor and the oppressed. And basically, he talked about how at some point you have to rise up against the oppressor. And I think that's where we've been.
Yeah.
Right, that's where we're at. And so that's in the letter to Birmingham, right? So I can't remember the exact quote, but that's what I remember that, right? You have to rise up. And I think that's where we are as a community, as a people, right? I think many of us are becoming more educated, right? Where we're moving beyond the characterization and the iconized characters,
Yeah.
And we're getting into the depths of who they were
Yeah.
and what they meant and what their mission was, right? And I think that's where we're moving to. And so that's the one quote that sticks out to me mostly.
Thank you, thank you. Now, here's the thing, and for our viewing audience, you know, all good things have to come to an end, and we're going to head toward conclusion. But Nick, well, in just a moment as we head to conclusion, final remarks will go in this order: Darius, Nicholas, and Kim. But before we do that, I want to share with folks, just to get people thinking about, we're both Muskegon Community College employees, and we had a conversation the other day, and you asked a question that resonated with me, and I'm going to put it out rhetorically, but some of you may want to use this when you think about your final statements. And you asked, had the legacy of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King been misrepresented? And that got me to thinking, and I don't have an answer for it.
You sure we got to end?
Yeah.
Look, I think we might need to.
But I want to put that, and so
Part two.
as we think about that, and, you know, we still have issues, we still have division, we still have people that want to separate, whether it's socioeconomic, whether it's race, whether it's gender. You know, there's a number of things. So that was just such of a powerful statement that I thought about it. I don't have a concrete answer for it. But as we head toward conclusion, and as I mentioned, Darius, followed by Nicholas, followed by Kim, what is the one last thing you want to share with people that might be tuning in today? And Darius, will go with you.
Wow. Well, again, thank you so much just for having us together. I'm a person that believes in new perspectives, and just that question, I'm with Mary Sims. I'm like, you sure we can't have a part two? Because that's a whole conversation within itself. And I think in closing, not to belabor anything else that we've talked about, because we've been very, very robust in this conversation. I just think that in closing, we need to understand that there needs to be a conversation, that we need to look and need to look at ourselves unapologetically and understand that what we originally were going for, just like anything else, that mission or that movement or objective may have changed, has changed in a lot of ways. So the crux of it is still social justice, racial equality, dealing in education, health, wellness, those things that are our founding pillars for the Urban League of West Michigan and a lot in the national and other organizations. But are we using those things, or are we approaching those things properly? I think that sometimes it becomes, it's a historic thing, but I think sometimes it becomes an emotional thing, because it's easy just to say, I'm a do-gooder. So I could very easily say, I'm the Director of Housing and Economic Security. I've shared what I do. Isn't this important stuff? But something that I've been thinking about is, it has to be more than just being at the table. What are you doing at the table? What are you bringing to the table? So I think there definitely needs to be a further articulation of these things, because no different than they took further articulations. To me, that's what an amendment is. They looked at something and said, hey, we started out well. We realized that now that we've dealt with that wasn't necessarily the root cause, or we need an amendment because we left some things out. So I think that we all need to take a hard look in the mirror, take our emotions out of it, and understand that we've done great things. But if we're honest with ourselves and we define success in a more proper sense, if we had done the job, we wouldn't still be talking about these same things in 2022. So I think in closing, that's where I would leave it. Let's have a further conversation, not to the oppressor, if you will. Let's look at ourselves and make sure before we go anywhere else that we're doing exactly what we need to do and being the best champions for ourselves before we can go ever look at anyone else.
Darius, thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes. Nicholas?
How to be short. It doesn't take a genius to know that there are scary things happening right now. We're extremely divided. People are even talking about the threat to the representative democracy that we have. Here's the good news and I don't want to project on Dr. King and say, he would definitely agree with me, but I think the majority of Americans, working class people, lower middle class people, have more that unites them, even if they don't always can acknowledge it or look past denominational divisions or who is a patriot and who is not. But I think underlying there are more solidarities, there are more potential solidarities and unifying things. Jobs. Everybody is concerned about their workplace. Everybody is concerned about their children's health. Everybody wants some sort of equitable access to health care. So there are things that we can unify around, and maybe the divisions are more illusory, even though there are scary things, there are threats out there. So maybe silver lining.
Thank you. Kim?
When I think about what you just stated, Nicholas, right, it's what we choose to focus on.
Yeah.
If we choose to focus on the divide, then we're going to move toward the divide, right? And I think all of us need to do a mindset, a reset, if you will, right, to look for those commonalities, because they're there. And Darius, you mentioned a couple times, and part of my closing, I want to make this statement. One, you being here is a representation of Dr. King. He was young.
Yeah.
Right, the civil rights movers, they weren't older, right? They were young, right? They were young, energetic, moving, right, and engaging in that way. So I want to say thank you for that, because that's another place we need to go back to. We have a hard time sometimes going back and making sure our young people are included in the fold, and we need to do a better job at that. But in my closing, I would definitely say, you mentioned the book that I gotta go get, right? And I'm gonna mention another one, and it's by Dr. King, and it's We Can't Wait. And it comes from the Letters on Birmingham, and it's a really good book, so I'm gonna suggest that one. But Darius, you also mentioned self-examination. I think that's key, because as we look and we can be honest with ourselves that I've done good, but I haven't done enough, because if I had, the issue still wouldn't exist.
Correct.
Right, and to be able to truly assess where we are and what's going on, and to be honest with that. Allow somebody to speak their truth. You don't have to agree with it.
That's a good point.
You don't have to like it, but it doesn't mean that it's not their truth. And out of respect for one another, right? Out of the dignity that we should be able to show one another that you mentioned earlier, we should be able to move in a way where we're showing each other that dignity and allowing us to speak our truth, so that we can objectively look at ourselves to be able to move us all to a better level. Realizing, yep, there were some wrongs done, and maybe you didn't do it, and maybe I didn't do it, but they were there, and it doesn't negate them, right? And so I think just a real hard, we all need to take a look at ourselves, realizing that we all have some kind of bias. Being honest about that and moving with that, right? But I believe in my community. I believe in Muskegon County, and I swear, I feel like if any county can do it, we can. We set the path and the trajectory for a lot of stuff in the state of Michigan. And I would love to see us set this one as well. So I want to say again, thank you to Muskegon Community College for your dedication, for it not to be an event, but for it to be a part of the fiber of who we are as a community.
Thank you. And to our viewing audience, I will close with answering the last thing that I would like to share. So as a diversity, equity, and inclusion thought leader, I do believe in the power of discourse, dialogue, and the dissemination of information. I stray away from argument and debate. And so if we can still sit down and have conversation that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King laid out for us, that we can head toward unification and we can do it peaceably, even if we agree to disagree, we can listen to each other and find commonality. So thank you. The one thing that I want to share with you as we head toward conclusion is, first of all, I want to take a moment and thank our panelists for sharing of their time and talents. Kim, Nicholas, Darius, thank you very much, and I'm giving you a virtual
Yeah, and
thank
to
you
you all,
very
yeah.
much
Thank you.
for sharing of your time. So,
Thank you.
and for those of you watching, I just want to thank you for viewing our panel discussion titled "The Timeless Impact of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Local Reflections." We look forward to seeing you at our 25th annual Martin Luther King Day Unity Day Breakfast, which will be on June 10th, 2022. Information can be found on Muskegon Community College's website. Special thanks to Dr. Dale Nesbary and everyone on the Unity Day Committee for your leadership in making this panel a reality. As we celebrate the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King holiday, we encourage you to take time to reflect and to attend other events honoring his legacy. Feel free to share the link of this video with your contacts and your networks. And we are also honored to provide to you one additional link to the NAACP Muskegon's 100-year anniversary video that was done just last year. So please take a look at that. On behalf of Muskegon Community College students, faculty and staff, and Board of Trustees, we thank you for watching. And I leave you with this quote from Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." Thank you. Have a great day.